Welcome to Starbound. If you're sick of AI-generated slop and want real human storytelling, please subscribe to support this channel. My name's Aram, I'll be your narrator. Let's get into the story. The scar creasing the skin above Savita's left eye was an invoice stamped in flesh. It itemized the cost of a conquered moon, a pulverized rebellion, and a life spent in the brilliant, soul-crushing routine of absolute victory. Her people, the Drakkar, saw the pale line and roared their approval in stadiums and plazas. She saw it in the flawless, silent chrome of her chambers and felt the immense gravity of an unbroken, perfect record. It was a weight that threatened to collapse her spine. An attendant automaton, a Model 9 curator droid whose movements were so fluid they were unnerving, affixed the final magnetic clasp on her ceremonial armor. As the machine's manipulators settled a pauldron etched with the star charts of the Cinderfall siege, a muscle below Savita's eye jumped, an unwelcome echo of that planet's perpetually gray sky, choked with the ash of its own cities and the acrid aftertaste of flawless strategy. Each plate of her armor was a triumph of Drakkar metallurgy, a canvas for the names of campaigns she had won. It felt less like a shield and more like a sarcophagus built around a still-beating heart, a monument to a life already concluded. She was the Princess General, the Unbroken, the living manifestation of the Vakresh dynasty's divine right to rule, proven through force. Yet, beneath the polished alloys and the perfectly sculpted muscle, a weariness deep as marrow had taken hold. She was a blade that had grown exhausted by its own edge, a predator who had scoured her territory so clean of rivals she was now starving. She craved a problem that couldn't be solved with troop deployments, a puzzle that resisted orbital bombardment. More than anything, she yearned for a gaze that held something other than fawning adoration or tactical apprehension. She was slowly, dreadfully coming to the conclusion that such a thing did not exist within the vast dominion. That thought was a monster more terrifying than any she had ever faced on a battlefield. Her chambers were a vast, minimalist expanse of black stone and polished metal at the apex of the Imperial spire. A single, immense viewport showed the capital world below, a sprawling circuit board of light and life that felt a million light years distant. The automaton retracted its arms with a barely audible hum and floated back to its charging alcove, its optical sensors a placid, unwavering blue. It was perfect. Everything was perfect. The silence in the room was absolute, a pressurized stillness that made the blood thrum in her ears. She felt like a specimen in a display case, perfectly preserved and utterly dead. The Grand Plaza of Ascension was a calculated sensory overload. The coordinated roar of a million citizens, the electric thrum of countless anti-grav platforms, and the disorienting glare of holographic banners all proclaimed the same three truths: the Dominion's strength, the Emperor's wisdom, and the peerless, world-breaking might of his daughter. Emperor Theon Vakresh stood at the rostrum, a figure of intimidating stillness. His voice was a perfectly calibrated instrument of power, each syllable resonating through the plaza's acoustic field generators with the force of a physical impact. He spoke of his daughter, not as a person, but as a historical event. He wove her victories into a grand narrative of dynastic destiny, a story that culminated, as it always did, in the forging of a new political alliance through a marital bond. Savita stood beside him, her face a sculpture of imperial stoicism. The bone-deep boredom she felt in her chambers had, under the heat of the public gaze, transformed into a brittle and dangerous contempt. Her father was selling her, again. He wasn't bartering for currency or territory. He had enough of both. He was trading her for something far more insidious: stability. He was plugging a potential crack in his empire with his daughter's life. He introduced the latest candidate, Duke Boros of the Forge Worlds, a hulking specimen of a Drakkar whose primary contribution to galactic culture was the invention of several new and innovative ways to grunt. The Duke, encased in ostentatious, gold filigreed armor, flexed a bicep the size of a lesser moon for the broadcast drones that swarmed around him like metallic wasps. The crowd, conditioned for generations, roared its approval. It was a pageant, a tedious, predictable, and utterly soul-destroying ritual of power she had suffered through on a dozen previous occasions with a dozen other brutish aristocrats. And as Duke Boros blew a kiss toward her with lips that seemed too small for his massive face, something fundamental inside Savita, some load-bearing strut of duty and obedience, finally gave way with a silent, catastrophic snap. A laugh, sharp and dry as powdered bone, cut through the Emperor's booming oration. The sound was utterly devoid of mirth. It was the sound of a pressure seal failing, of a cage door breaking its lock. The entire plaza went quiet. The abrupt absence of sound was a physical shock, a vacuum that pulled at the ears. Even the colossal holographic banners seemed to stutter, their animations freezing for a half-second. Savita stepped forward. The heels of her armored boots rang against the marble stage, each step a hammer blow against the silence.
Duty!
The word was a blade slicing through the stunned atmosphere.
Lineage!
She swept a gauntleted hand in a gesture of magnificent dismissal toward the preening Duke and the carefully arranged line of other powerful suitors.
These are concepts earned in the crucible of battle, not gifted in the perfumed air of a throne room.
Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, swept across the endless sea of faces. The broadcast drones, recovering from their shock, swarmed her, their lenses like the compound eyes of some great insect. They transmitted her defiance to every screen on every world in the Dominion. Her father's face, visible on the monitor beside the rostrum, was a mask of placid fury. But he was caught. He couldn't silence her. She was the very bedrock of their culture, the unassailable virtue of strength, as a weapon against him. She let the quiet stretch, allowing the apprehension to build. She savored the raw, beautiful, unpredictable chaos she had just created. Then, with the timing of a master strategist, she delivered the killing blow.
I will wed the first being in this galaxy who can best me in single combat.
It was an absurdity. A gauntlet thrown down not in earnest challenge, but in supreme, untouchable dismissal. She expected no one to answer. It was a public declaration of her own impossibility, a final, magnificent refusal to be a pawn in her father's political games. The crowd, after a collective intake of breath that sounded like a receding tide, detonated. It was scandalous. It was blasphemous. It was glorious. It was, without question, the greatest spectacle they had ever witnessed. Savita had placed her father in checkmate on a board the size of the galaxy. Cutter was operating on 3 hours of sleep, the dregs of a caffeine patch that had ceased operations an hour ago, and the faint, lingering fumes of a potent spirit he'd shared with a 3-armed freighter pilot from the Outer Rims. He'd managed to slip his ship, the questionable asset, into a low-traffic orbital dock at the Drakkar capital using a stolen maintenance crew's frequency spoofer and a healthy dose of audacity. It wasn't so much a plan as a professional compulsion to check for unlocked doors. He was supposed to be acquiring a sensitive data package for a nervous corporate client, but his contact was late, and the escalating noise from the planet's surface had piqued his curiosity. He heard the declaration on a borrowed public comlink. The Drakkar words filtered through a cheap, slightly sarcastic translation app he'd picked up on a backwater trading post.
I will marry whoever beats me.
He paused in the methodical demolition of a nutrient-dense ration bar that tasted vaguely of salted cardboard. On the giant holographic display overhanging the plaza, a warrior goddess who had to be 7 feet tall and clad in chrome armor was staring down an entire empire. She was magnificent. She was terrifying. And under all that polished metal and fury, she looked profoundly bored. Cutter knew that look. He'd seen it in the mirror right before making a number of questionable life choices that had turned out to be incredibly fun. A drunken bet he'd made weeks ago with that same 3-armed pilot sloshed around in his memory. Something about proving human audacity was a tangible physical force. He'd wagered a crate of very old, very illegal Martian whiskey. Why not? He thought, a slow grin spreading across his face. He brushed the ration bar crumbs from his patched-up, grease-stained flight suit. The movement produced a faint, discordant jingle from the collection of tools on his utility belt. A multi-tool with several non-standard attachments, a battered sidearm with a scorch mark near the emitter known to occasionally discharge in reverse, and a trio of small, kinetic charges he'd affectionately called door knockers. It was standard equipment for a man who viewed a locked door not as an obstacle, but as a personal insult. He began to shoulder his way through the stunned Drakkar crowd. They parted for him, a forest of towering, armored redwoods staring down at the absurdly small, soft-looking creature weaving between their legs. The murmurs he elicited were a mix of confusion and contempt. He reached the security cordon at the edge of the stage, a shimmering curtain of energy. Without breaking stride, he vaulted over it before the heavily armed guards could process his existence, much less react to it. He strode onto the polished marble. The plaza's acoustic amplifiers, still dialed to maximum sensitivity from the Emperor's speech, picked up the soft, worn scuff of his boots. An entire galaxy held its breath. Cutter grinned up at the warrior princess, shielding his eyes from the glare off her armor. "All right, I'll bite," he called out, his voice amplified to a ridiculous volume, echoing across the now deathly silent square. "I've got a long trip back to the terminus and could honestly use the exercise. When do we start?" For the first time that day, the perfect glacial control on Princess General Savita's face cracked. It was replaced by a flicker of something he'd never seen on a Drakkar before. Genuine, startled, and utterly intoxicating amusement. Emperor Theon was ensnared in a trap of his daughter's design, and he knew it. The duel was now sanctioned by public acclamation, broadcast on every channel from the core worlds to the lawless Outer Rim. To deny it would be to admit fear. It would be to suggest that this lone, ragged human could pose a credible threat to the unbroken Princess General. It would be a political catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. His face, projected on a 1,000-foot hologram above the city, was a masterclass in weaponized serenity. Cutter, squinting up at the colossal image, suspected the man was mentally calculating the orbital drop rate required to vaporize his head without damaging the surrounding marble. The Circle of Proving was a vast, sand-filled arena, ancient and hallowed, surrounded by roaring spectators stacked 10,000 high. Cutter stretched like a bored cat, pointedly ignoring the torrent of insults raining down from the stands. The commentary was mostly unimaginative, focusing on his diminutive stature, his conspicuous lack of armor, and his general, undeniable squishiness. One particularly loud spectator kept bellowing something his translator app rendered as,
"Prepare to be folded, soft thing."
Then she entered. Savita was a vision of martial perfection. Her ornate ceremonial armor was gone, replaced by a more functional, form-fitting combat harness of dark, non-reflective metal. In her hand she held a plasma glaive, its containment field humming a low, lethal thrum that vibrated in Cutter's teeth. The crowd went utterly berserk. The duel began not with a gong or a bell, but with the sonic boom of Savita crossing the 50 yards of sand between them in the time it took Cutter to blink. She was a storm, a blur of overwhelming force and devastating elegance. Her glaive carved incandescent arcs through the air, each swing powerful enough to liquefy a bunker door. The air crackled, thick with the scent of superheated silicates and discharged energy that smelled like hot metal and burnt sugar. Cutter didn't even attempt to meet her force with his own. That was a fool's game, and while he was many things, he was rarely a fool. He was pure reaction, a leaf caught in a hurricane. He dodged, he weaved, he slid under swings that would have neatly cauterized him into two separate, smoldering pieces. His movements were not designed to win, they were designed to learn. He wasn't fighting her, he was downloading her. Every feint, every pivot, every calculated angle of her attack was data. He was mapping her rhythm, her footwork, the almost imperceptible tensing of her shoulders that telegraphed her intent. Right foot heavy, telegraphs the lunge, good. 2-beat rhythm on the overhead swing, predictable. She favors her left side for wide sweeps. The sand, vitrified into glass by the near misses of her blade, crunched under his boots. For 20 agonizing minutes that stretched into an eternity, the pattern held. It was a battle of human endurance against Drakkar explosive power. The insults from the crowd slowly tapered off, replaced by a confused, rising murmur. The human was not falling. The human was not even bleeding. He was still there, a frustrating, impossibly agile gnat buzzing around their glorious goddess of war. Savita felt a flicker of something she hadn't experienced since her academy days. Frustration. He wasn't fighting, he was observing. It was infuriating. Cutter had her timing. He felt the rhythm in his bones, the predictable, powerful cadence of her relentless assault. It was time to change the music. He stopped merely dodging and started countering. He slid under a sweeping decapitation strike that sizzled the air above his head, popped up inside her guard where the long glaive was useless, and slammed the heel of his palm into the articulation joint of her elbow. It was a dirty, unpredictable street brawler's move, and it earned him a grunt of genuine surprise. "Parry, parry, thrust! On guard!" he yelled, ducking a retaliatory backhand that would have sent his head spinning into the 5th row. Savita's tactical HUD inside her helmet flickered with red error messages, the combat computer trying and failing to find a translation or strategic context for the archaic Earth fencing terms. In that split second of data lag, Cutter moved. He didn't have her strength, so he used her momentum against her. He dropped low, hooked his leg around her ankle in a classic judo throw that sent screaming agony through every muscle in his own leg, and pulled. The 7-foot warrior goddess stumbled. For the first time in a decade of flawless victories, her perfect form was broken. For the first time, their bodies collided not as weapon against shield, but as flesh and bone against armor and muscle. He was pressed against her, the air thick with the sharp scent of her personal shield struggling to recalibrate. Her body was a furnace, a solid wall of power that felt like colliding with a moving vehicle. She recovered instantly, throwing him off as a child might shake a toy. But the distance between them, the formal, respectful distance of the duel, had vanished. It had become a brawl. He launched himself forward and headbutted her helmet. The impact made his teeth rattle and his vision swim in a sea of bright, painful stars, but it clearly staggered her. She responded with a vicious elbow to his ribs that cracked two of them with an audible snap and stole the air from his lungs in a painful gasp. They broke apart, both breathing heavily, chests heaving, and for the first time, Savita grinned. It was not the cold, dismissive smile of a superior warrior. It was a true, predatory, bloodthirsty grin. The combat stimulants sang in her veins, but for the first time in years, they felt redundant. This feeling, this raw, unpredictable challenge was the drug she'd been unknowingly craving. The game had changed. This was fun. The look on her face was the most terrifying and exhilarating thing Cutter had ever seen. The twin suns of the Drakkar homeworld beat down, turning the arena into a crucible. The duel had devolved from a display of martial grace into a brutal symphony of pain. Every impact on Savita's armor rang like a cracked bell. Cutter could feel the grit of the arena floor grinding into the raw, bleeding skin of his palms. His body was a tapestry of deep purple bruises and angry red burns. Savita's flawless combat harness was now dented and scored, and a thin trickle of violet blood ran from her split lip, a shocking slash of color against her pale skin. They were both running on fumes, fueled by nothing more than pure, unadulterated stubbornness. Cutter knew he couldn't last much longer. His jury-rigged kinetic staff, a piece of tech he'd cobbled together from 3 different incompatible systems, was flickering, the power cell indicator blinking a cheerful final red. He had one last trick, a dangerous, stupid, warranty-voiding trick he'd wired into the staff for a rainy day. Looking up at the twin suns, he decided it was pouring. He baited her into a powerful, 2-handed overhead strike, a move designed to split a man from scalp to sternum. As the plasma glaive descended like a miniature sun, he channeled every last drop of power from his suit's capacitor directly into the staff's kinetic emitter. It was a function that wasn't so much designed as it was allowed to happen by a series of bypassed safety regulators. "Geronimo!" he screamed, the word a nonsensical prayer to the gods of improvisation. The staff exploded with kinetic force. The feedback sent fractures spiderwebbing through the bones in his forearm and threw him backwards 10 feet to land in a crumpled heap. But the directed blast caught the plasma glaive dead on. The weapon, a priceless Drakkar artifact forged in the heart of a neutron star, was torn from Savita's grasp. It went spinning end over end into the arena wall, where it embedded itself to the hilt with a deep, resonant thrum. Silence. They stood, panting, 50 feet apart. He was disarmed, his arm shattered, and barely conscious. She was disarmed and utterly spent. They stared at each other across the shimmering sand, two exhausted wolves who had finally found an equal. On their faces were identical, bloody, triumphant grins. The arena judges, high in their gilded, climate-controlled box, were frozen in a state of unprecedented confusion. Victory and defeat were the only two states of being in Drakkar combat doctrine. There was no procedure, no protocol for this. After a frantic, whispered conference that was broadcast to the entire waiting galaxy, a quavering voice announced the official verdict: a draw. The word was an ontological shock. It rippled through the crowd not as a cheer or a boo, but as a wave of pure, unadulterated, system-crashing confusion. The galactic nets exploded. The Emperor's face, still projected above the arena, was a mask of cold, controlled fury. His perfect political trap had just sprung back and snapped shut on his own leg. Before he could issue an order to execute the human, to declare a do-over, to do anything to regain control, Savita let out a bark of genuine, unrestrained laughter. The sound echoed in the stunned arena, rich and full of a life that had been absent only an hour before. She stalked across the sand, her every step radiating a power that had nothing to do with her title. She ignored her discarded weapon, ignored the sputtering judges, ignored her father's silent, incandescent rage. She stopped in front of the stunned, bleeding human, grabbed him by the front of his flight suit, and hauled him bodily from the arena as if he weighed nothing. The Imperial guards made a move to intercept, but one look from her stopped them dead in their tracks.
Finally,
she growled, her voice a low vibration meant only for him, a promise and a threat all in one.
Someone worth my time.
In the silent, cavernous throne room, Emperor Theon was paralyzed. It was not by indecision, but by the cold, hard logic of public opinion. The draw, as the galactic nets were now calling it, was the single biggest news event of the decade. Viral clips of the humans' absurd war cries and Savita's shocking, joyous laughter were already collector's items, traded on every network from the core to the rim. To execute Cutter now would be a public admission of fear. It would be a confession that the human was a genuine threat, that he had truly met the Princess General as an equal. The admission would undermine the very foundation of Drakkar superiority that his dynasty was built upon. He was trapped between his imperial rage and his political pragmatism. He could already feel the tremors through the empire. The great houses, his rivals who had long chafed under his absolute rule, smelled blood in the water. His daughter's impulsive, glorious stunt had destabilized his power in a way no war ever could. He was forced to let the human live. For now. But pragmatism had many tools, and not all of them were public. Cutter was trying to figure out the controls for a Drakkar sonic shower. He'd already accidentally subjected himself to a high-frequency exfoliation cycle that made his teeth vibrate, and a polishing cycle that left his skin feeling unnervingly smooth, when a man who looked like he was born in a three-piece suit materialized in the doorway of the lavish guest suite. Vizier Maldor, the Emperor's right hand, oozed a kind of polite menace that Cutter was intimately familiar with. It was the universal language of people who had others killed for a living. The offer was elegant, clean, and astronomically generous. A brand new, top-of-the-line freighter, a Cormorant-class hauler with custom shields, A clean slate, all bounties, warrants, and unfortunate misunderstandings with customs officials wiped from every major systems database, and a personal credit chit with enough zeros on it to make a planetary governor weep with envy. All for disappearing, quietly, permanently. Cutter listened patiently, leaning against the shower's control panel. He grinned. "Let me get this straight," he said. "You want to pay me a fortune to run away from a 7-foot-tall, ridiculously attractive warrior princess who is, by a significant margin, the only interesting thing to happen to me in a decade?" The vizier's placid composure remained flawless, but a tiny muscle in his left eye twitched. Cutter clapped the man on his perfectly tailored shoulder, a gesture of casual familiarity that was clearly physically horrifying to him. "Tell the big guy I appreciate the offer, but my dance card is full. And you can send him my bill for the armor repairs. This flight suit isn't cheap, you know. Sentimental value." The vizier retreated, his dignity in tatters. The message had been sent and received. The human could not be bought, therefore he would have to be removed. In Savita's private medbay, the air hummed with the quiet thrum of advanced medical technology. She had dismissed the droids. The room was stark, white, and sterile, a sharp contrast to the raw, messy reality of the man sitting on the edge of the diagnostic bed. Cutter's chest was a spectacular constellation of deep purple and sickly yellow bruises. She held a regenerative balm, its container cool against her palm. Her hands, calloused and strong, accustomed to the weight and balance of a plasma glaive, were surprisingly gentle as she applied the balm to a nasty plasma burn on his shoulder. "Your skin is so soft," she murmured, the observation sounding both clinical and laced with a strange, dangerous intimacy. "A Drakkar infant has a tougher hide." Cutter winced, more from her proximity than the sting of the balm. Her presence was overwhelming, a gravitational field he was finding it difficult to resist. "Yeah, well, we humans bruise easily. It's part of our charm. Makes us look sympathetic." Her fingers lingered, tracing the line of his deltoid muscle. The physical disparity between them was stark. Her hand, even without armor, spanned his entire shoulder. Her thumb could probably dislocate it without any real effort. The thought was not nearly as alarming as it should have been. The air in the sterile room crackled, thick and heavy, smelling of antiseptic and something that reminded him of the moments before a lightning strike. It was the same energy that had filled the arena, but now, stripped of the roaring crowd and the threat of imminent death, it felt different, sharper, more potent. Savita found him in one of the palace's zero-gravity training rooms. He was floating in the center, a multi-tool in hand, trying to hotwire a sophisticated Drakkar training drone to play music from a data chip he carried. His left forearm, encased in a humming regenerative brace, still sent jolts of phantom pain up to his shoulder. "My father's vizier paid you a visit," she said, her voice flat. She sealed the door, the magnetic lock engaging with a heavy, final thud. Cutter stopped tinkering with the drone. Yeah, nice guy. Very well dressed. Offered me a bunch of money to go away forever. I told him I was having too much fun to leave just yet." "You are a fool," she stated, kicking off from the wall and gliding toward him with the deadly grace of a shark. "I've been called worse," he shot back, a grin tugging at his lips. "Usually by people whose money I've just liberated." Their spar began without a word. It was a raw, weaponless continuation of their duel, a storm of grappling and strikes in the disorienting three-dimensional space. The absence of gravity made it a pure test of leverage and reaction time. She was stronger, faster, a being born for combat. He was more unpredictable, using the walls to ricochet in at odd angles, a chaotic element she couldn't quite predict. Finally, she caught him, her superior strength winning out. She pinned him against a padded wall, her forearm pressed firmly against his throat, her body caging his. They floated there, a tangle of limbs, their faces inches apart. He could feel the furious, hammering beat of her heart against his chest.
"I could shatter your larynx before you could blink,"
she whispered, her breath warm against his skin. He didn't struggle. He didn't fight back. He leaned into the pressure, his eyes locking on hers, a silent, defiant challenge in their depths.
"So do it,"
he rasped, the words a dare. A war raged in her eyes, the disciplined general versus the woman who had laughed in the arena. The general lost. Instead of breaking him, she kissed him. It was a collision, a savage, desperate claiming. There was nothing soft or gentle about it. It was teeth and tongue and the silent, furious release of all the pressure that had been building since he first stepped out of the crowd and into her life. It was the duel continued by other means, a battle for dominance that neither of them truly wanted to win. Later, they stood on a high, wind-swept balcony, the glittering expanse of the Drakkar capital city spread out below them like a carpet of fallen stars. The fury of their kiss had settled into a quiet, humming intensity. For the first time, they simply talked. He told her of a life lived on the run, in the margins of the galaxy, surviving on his wits and a fundamental, stubborn refusal to die. He spoke of starship engines held together with scavenged parts and a prayer, of cons pulled on pompous officials on a dozen different worlds, of the chaotic, messy, terrifying freedom of having nothing to lose. She, in turn, told him of a life lived in a gilded cage.
"When I was a girl,"
she began, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it.
"I tried to run away. I found an ancient map of the spider's older levels from a less efficient age."
She gestured vaguely at the labyrinthine structure below.
"I thought this old plasma waste conduit running right under these chambers was my secret escape route, a flaw in the fortress. My father's guards caught me before I even reached the access panel. They sealed it the next day."
She gave a short, bitter laugh.
"He told me it was for my own protection. He was just adding another bar to the cage."
Cutter just nodded, his gaze following her gesture down into the dizzying depths of the city. But in the back of his mind, a mental schematic was being drawn. An old conduit, a sealed entrance, a flaw in the fortress. In his line of work, that kind of information was worth more than a fleet of new freighters. The Emperor's pragmatism took its final, darkest turn. A beautifully gift-wrapped package was delivered to Cutter's quarters by a silent servitor. He didn't open it. He'd learned long ago that unexpected gifts from powerful people who wanted you gone tended to explode. He casually tossed it out a window into the meticulously maintained ornamental gardens, where it detonated with a beautiful, silent flash of plasma that incinerated a prized collection of genetically engineered sentient flora. The next attempt was less subtle. A squad of the Emperor's elite Ghost Guard ambushed him in the lower-level markets, where he'd gone in search of a decent power converter for his ship. They moved like shadows, their forms blurred by personal stealth fields, their vibroblades humming a song of silent death. Cutter survived on pure animal instinct and a lifetime of practice in chaotic situations. He kicked over a stall of writhing, levitating sky eels, using the slimy, screaming creatures as a living airborne distraction. He shattered a canister of pressurized gas from a nearby welding shop, filling the alley with a thick, choking fog. He used the environment as both weapon and shield, a frantic improvisation against a team of silent, disciplined killers. He escaped, but not unscathed. A deep gash in his side from a vibroblade bled sluggishly, the wound refusing to clot properly due to the blade's ultrasonic frequency. He slumped against a grimy wall in a service corridor, the adrenaline fading, leaving only a deep, throbbing pain. Pulling a field med cauterizer from his belt, he slapped the device onto the wound. He hissed through his teeth as the device sealed the gash with a burst of searing heat and the agonizing smell of his own cooked flesh. Resourcefulness hurt. He knew who had sent them, and he knew he couldn't get back to Savita through the front door. The palace was no longer a temporary residence. It was a hunting ground, and he was the prey. Clutching his freshly sealed side, Cutter pried open a service panel and disappeared into the dark, grimy underbelly of the Imperial Spire. He was running a mental map he'd started building the moment he snuck onto the planet, cross-referencing it with Savita's bitter childhood memory. An old conduit, a sealed entrance, a way in. It was a grueling journey through a forgotten maze of humming power relays, dripping sanitation pipes, and dusty maintenance shafts. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, decay, and lubricant. His vision started to tunnel from the blood loss, but he pushed on, driven by a single stubborn thought. Get to her. After what felt like an eternity of crawling and climbing, he found it. A thick, circular access panel covered in decades of dust, bearing an archaic Drakkar engineering seal. It was exactly where a structural flaw, a forgotten back door, would be. Prying it open took the last of his strength. He crawled inside the dark, cavernous pipe and followed it upwards, the sound of his own ragged breathing echoing in the oppressive quiet. He emerged, bleeding, exhausted, and covered in filth, through a hidden maintenance panel in the floor of Savita's pristine, minimalist chambers. He collapsed on her floor, leaving a smear of blood and grime on the polished chrome. The sight of Cutter, hunted, wounded, and bleeding on her floor, shattered the last vestiges of Savita's dynastic loyalty. This was not the act of a pragmatic emperor protecting his lineage. This was the act of a tyrant, a father willing to murder a man in his daughter's name simply because he could not be controlled. It was an insult to her, to the duel, to the very concept of honor she had been raised to embody. Before she could even reach him, the doors to her chambers burst open. A squad of royal guards, led by a grim-faced captain, stormed in. "By order of the Emperor," the captain announced, his voice devoid of emotion. "The human is to be detained for questioning." Detained. A euphemism for a quiet execution in a soundproofed room. Savita didn't say a word. She didn't need to. With a flick of her wrist, her personal plasma glaive, a sleeker, more lethal model she kept in her chambers, ignited with a hungry hiss. The guards hesitated. They were loyal to the Emperor, but they had served the Princess General on a dozen battlefields. They knew that look in her eyes. It was the look she got right before she broke an enemy army in half. She moved through them not as a princess, but as the general she was. She was a whirlwind of brutal, non-lethal force. The flat of her blade against a helmet, a pommel strike to a chest plate, a disarming maneuver that sent a pulse rifle clattering to the floor. In seconds, her own elite guard lay groaning on the ground, disabled but alive. The line had been crossed. There was no going back. She had chosen her side.
"The royal hangers!"
Savita snarled, hauling a stumbling Cutter to his feet.
"Now!"
They fought their way through the palace corridors. Alarms blared, their klaxons a screeching counterpoint to the hiss of plasma fire. Guards swarmed them from every intersection. It was a blur of searing energy and frantic improvisation. Cutter, fighting through the searing pain in his side, used his knowledge of security systems to trigger false alarms, lockdown procedures, and even the palace's automated sanitation drones, sowing chaos in their wake. Savita was the tip of the spear, a terrifying, beautiful engine of destruction, her glaive a blur of incandescent light. They burst into the royal hangars and commandeered a sleek two-person royal skiff. The cockpit was painfully small, forcing them into close, constant contact as Savita blasted the ship out into the skyways of the capital. A squadron of Veyron interceptors rose to meet them, their weapons glowing with deadly intent. Their banter, once a tool of flirtation and antagonism, was now a seamless tactical shorthand.
Shields are down to 40%! I'm gonna need you to pull an old yeller on that lead fighter's engine!
Cutter yelled over the scream of the engines, furiously rewiring power from the inertial dampeners to the shield emitters. Savita, who had forced him to explain the archaic and frankly barbaric Earth film One Sleepless Night, gritted her teeth. She understood. Cripple, don't kill.
A merciful fate,
she muttered, and fired a single shot from the skiff's light cannons. The blast tore through the interceptor's port engine, sending it spinning harmlessly out of formation. They were boxed in. The interceptors herded them with disciplined grace, cutting off every escape vector. But Savita wasn't retreating. She was a predator. Predators didn't run. They chose their battlefield.
Running makes us prey,
she snarled, banking the skiff so hard Cutter felt his organs shift.
We are seizing the stage.
She pushed the throttle to its limit and aimed the skiff not for the open sky, but for the heart of the spire, for the great armored viewport of the throne room itself. They crashed through in a shower of transparent armor plates and shrieking metal, skidding across the polished marble floor to halt just feet from the Emperor's throne. The court scattered in terror. For a single, silent moment, the chaos paused. Savita met her father's gaze across the wreckage. In his eyes, she saw not just rage, but the cold, devastating grief of a king witnessing the death of his legacy. In hers, he saw only the raging fires of rebellion. The moment broke. Emperor Theon rose, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent fury. Standing between them and the throne was Duke Boros, the suitor Savita had so publicly scorned. He was now the Emperor's champion, his already massive frame augmented with gleaming cybernetics, a crackling power maul held in his grip. Savita engaged him head-on, her glaive a blur of light against his heavy maul. Cutter darted around the periphery, a constant, annoying, unpredictable distraction.
Okay, now use the Rock'em Sock'em Robots uppercut!
Cutter shouted. Savita had no idea what the words meant, but she understood the tactical imperative from his tone and his stance. She feinted low, then brought her glaive up in a brutal, rising arc that forced Boros to raise his maul defensively, exposing his cybernetically enhanced torso.
Do the T-pose of dominance!
Cutter yelled, planting his feet wide. Savita, again parsing pure intent from utter nonsense, held her glaive in a wide, sweeping defensive stance, forcing Boros to widen his own to counter. A textbook maneuver. It was just the opening Cutter needed. He lunged forward, slapping the trio of kinetic door knockers from his belt onto the cybernetic joints of Boros' knees and elbows. He dove back into a roll as Savita disengaged.
Fire in the hole!
The charges detonated. Not with a large explosion, but with sharp, focused kinetic pulses. Boros' cybernetic limbs locked up and buckled. The giant crashed to the floor, disarmed and immobilized, twitching and sparking. With the champion defeated, Savita turned to face her father. The entire stunned court and the live galactic broadcast bore witness. With a gesture of profound, heartbreaking finality, she unclasped the ceremonial crest of the Vakresh dynasty from her shoulder, the symbol of her rank, her title, her lineage, and threw it at his feet. It clattered on the marble, a sound more damning than any explosion.
I renounce my title. I renounce my name,
she declared, her voice ringing with absolute, unwavering conviction. Then she turned, grabbed Cutter by the collar of his ruined flight suit, and pulled him into a fierce, defiant kiss that left no room for interpretation. She was claiming him, not as a prize, but as her equal.
We yield to no one,
she proclaimed, her voice carrying across the galaxy. In the ensuing uproar, as the royal guards finally began to regroup, she grabbed Cutter's hand.
This way! The old dignitary transport chute!
She yelled, pulling him toward a decorative panel near the throne. Cutter's mind clicked into place. The chute, a forgotten vertical shaft for emergency egress. He'd seen it on the schematics. It was an express route to the lower levels, directly toward the cargo base where he'd hidden his ship, the questionable asset. Her battlefield knowledge and his covert planning slamming together in a moment of perfect, chaotic energy. They dove headfirst into the dark chute together, escaping the chaos of the throne room and descending into the unknown depths of the palace, their hands locked tightly together. Months later, the cargo hold of the questionable asset smelled of engine lubricant, ozone, and hot metal. It was their training room, their dining room, their home. Cutter and Savita circled each other, sparring with blunted practice staffs. Their movements were a fluid, intimate dance of sweat, muscle, and laughter. The desperation of their first fight was gone, replaced by the pure, unadulterated joy of the challenge. He feinted left, then spun right, using a move he'd been practicing for weeks. For the first time in hundreds of spars, he landed a clean, soft tap on her jaw. She froze, her eyes widened in genuine, unfeigned surprise. Then she laughed, a deep, throaty sound that echoed in the metal room. She dropped her staff and tackled him, all 7 feet of her, sending them both crashing to the deck plating in a tangle of limbs. She pinned him easily, her weight a comforting, familiar presence.
I let you win,
she murmured, before kissing him. There was a faint, metallic tang of blood on her lips from a split she'd gotten earlier. It tasted like victory. Later, lying together amidst scattered ship parts and diagnostic tools, Cutter pulled up a holographic bounty puck he'd acquired at their last stop, a grimy refueling station in a lawless sector. The image of a notorious pirate lord, a 4-armed corsair with a ludicrously large mustache, flickered in the low light. High-risk contract, high-reward payout. On a lawless outer rim world known for eating ships like his for breakfast. He looked at her, one eyebrow raised in a silent question. Savita grinned back, a wild, beautiful, dangerous thing.
Looks like fun,
she said. They were fugitives, they were outcasts, they were legends in the making, undefeated, and their adventure had only just begun. That beginning stretched into a new reality. Their names, once broadcast in the context of imperial scandal, were now whispered in the shadowy cantinas and bustling trade hubs of the Outer Rim, not as Savita Vakresh, the fallen princess, and Cutter, the human rogue, They were known simply as the Draw, a singular noun for a two-person force of nature. They took on impossible jobs, not for the money, though the credits were a welcome bonus, but for the sheer, unadulterated challenge of it. They toppled crime syndicates, rescued hostages from corporate black sites, and once, on a drunken dare from Cutter, stole the ceremonial toupee of a very pompous Julian ambassador. On the bridge of the questionable asset, now upgraded with so much formidable, questionably sourced Drakkar tech that it was more of a pocket warship than a freighter, Savita watched Cutter pilot them through a dense asteroid field. He wasn't just flying, he was dancing, weaving the ship through the tumbling rocks with an artist's flair, a wide grin plastered on his face. The rigid, perfect lines of Imperial fleet formations were a lifetime away. This was chaos, and she found it beautiful.
If my academy instructors could see this,
she mused, her voice a low, amused rumble.
They would have me executed for heresy. Then they would have you executed for fun.
Hey, heresy is just what people call a good idea they didn't have first. Cutter shot back, banking the ship so hard the inertial dampeners groaned in protest. He looked over at her, his eyes full of a light she'd never seen in anyone under the twin suns of her homeworld. It wasn't awe or fear. It was trust, absolute and unconditional. Besides, he added, I'm a bad influence. It's part of my charm. She laughed, a real, genuine sound that no longer felt foreign in her own throat. She walked up behind his pilot's chair and placed her hands on his shoulders. Her hands, which had once felt the weight of an empire, now felt the simple, solid reality of the man who had shown her that a draw could be a greater victory than 1,000 conquests. She thought back to the woman she had been, entombed in flawless armor and suffocated by perfection. She saw the scar above her eye not as an invoice for a life of victory, but as the final bill for a life she was glad to have left behind. Cutter leaned his head back against her, looking up. So, he said, gesturing to the star-dusted void ahead. Where to next, General? Savita traced the faint new scar along his jawline, a memento from their last brawl.
The title is retired,
she said softly, her thumb brushing his skin.
Just Savita now.
She looked past him, into the endless, star-strewn expanse that was no longer a map of territories to be conquered, but a canvas of possibilities. A home.
And you're the pilot. You pick the stars. I'll handle anyone who gets in our way.
He reached up and took her hand. His grip was warm and sure. Their fingers interlaced, the calloused, warrior hands of a Drakkar and the clever, nimble hands of a human. They were a perfect contradiction, a living paradox, strength tempered by ingenuity, discipline guided by chaos. They were two halves of a legend that the galaxy would tell for centuries to come. And in the quiet hum of the star drive, surrounded by the infinite freedom they had fought for and won, they yielded to no one, for they had everything they could ever need right where they were, together, undefeated.